Washington's after some big-time prospects in 2026.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's site editor with Athlon Sports' Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just a reminder, wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast, we really do appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe right here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. All that really does help us out a lot. Like the video, leave a comment down below if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that. With that being said, really fun show coming up today. We're talking about some of the highest rated prospects that UW is after that we want to see in purple and gold. We're going to talk about the importance of this in-state recruiting class of 2026 because it's a good one. But Lars, speaking of in-state, that leads into what we wanted to lead off with today, which is the top targets for Washington's 2026 class. And there are higher rated guys out there, but nobody's more important than four-star edge rusher Derek Colman-Brusa.
Yeah, and we've seen as much on social media over the past 2 weeks as coaches and everybody's been able to go on the road recruiting. Every, I think, 2 hours, there's a different school coming to see Derek Colman-Brusa. And it's just like, hey, this coach. And for reason why I bring this up, Washington was one of the first. The entire Ryan Walters, Jason Capusi, there was at least 2 or 3 other coaches that stopped by that day at Kennedy to go check on some guys, and obviously Derek Colman-Brusa. And I think that, to me, was the most important one, why you had to make that Ryan Walters hire before the coaches went out on the trail recruiting, because you had to know, unlike last year, it was Jedd came in mid-January, and it's, hey, we're working on some guys, we're hearing some guys, and this guy might be a fit, this guy might yada, yada, yada. No, you need to know who you're going on the trail to go get. And I think it's big for what we've said when you talk about the bare front that Ryan Walters is probably going to run. How would Derek Colman-Brusa fit in that as an edge? And, to build off of that, the other 2 guys in the state that we'll talk about here in a bit. But more specifically, Derek, you got his older brother, Lowen Colman-Brusa. Now you need to make sure, where we've seen, Derek loves UW, been to UW many times. That's a guy that no matter what happens with the rest of the in-state class, you have to get Derek to Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the biggest parts of this is it's because it's not just about recruiting in state. That's a huge part of it. That's really important. It's not just that he's the number one player in state. It's that he plays the position that you are probably most desperately in need of right now. And it's getting a real, true game-wrecking defensive line talent. And there are a couple other ones that, as you said, we're going to dive into in a minute in terms of just the in-state class, because Washington, we're not going to talk about a lot of other defensive linemen just like early on in this show, because there are a lot of good players out there, but Washington might be able to make a pretty significant dent in just closing a talent gap along the defensive line with a strong in-state class. So I want to talk about the offensive line, because one guy who I'm a huge fan of, I just love the size, the profile, everything, is four-star Archbishop Reardon offensive lineman Tommy Tofi. This is a guy who I love like I said, I love the profile. I love the athleticism. He's the teammate of former Washington commit Peter Lange, and somebody who just really stands out on that offensive line in terms of the ability to play tackle if you want him to, guard if you want him to, where that's just a Brendan Carroll thing. So we're probably going to talk about that with every offensive lineman that we bring up in this 2026 class. But in terms of Tommy, you want to see Washington continue to close on top-end high school talent along the offensive line. We saw the way the Zach Staskowski recruitment played out, and it didn't end the way you wanted it to. You need to make up for that this season. There are a couple of guys that I wanted to just make sure I mentioned. Tommy Tofi is probably number 1 on my list.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, knowing that you got Tofi already secured, that's probably worth. It's like you already got one on the board. So you're not saying this is the first offensive tackle that they would take, but just maybe the one of highest priority, similar to 25 to when you're looking at Douglas Uchu and things like that. Yeah. From that perspective, also another guy that you've had guys come from Archbishop Reardon, before. Chris Lawson in the 25 class. For a second, I had Peter Lange. That one was kind of a separate situation. I don't think that would impact future Archbishop Reardon players. And also worth noting, the head coach of Archbishop Reardon played with Jordan Papo in college. So there's a relationship on staff that goes back pretty deeply. And also Papo was a former offensive lineman at one time. So you kind of combined all those things together. They know what UW is looking for in an offensive lineman. They know what the scheme is going to be. There's a very easy kind of path and trajectory to doing some of that. And it's not to say that you're going to go take only kids from this school or that school, but it certainly helps when you look at the recruiting pitch and say, we're on the West Coast. And I think that's another thing where we talked about in the 25 class, where the talent on the West Coast in the trenches was down, more so on the defensive line than the offensive line. But just in general, the trenches weren't necessarily what they should be on the West Coast. In years like this where they are, where you need to go get multiple 4-stars along the offensive line, you need to make sure you can do that. And it starts basically your backyard is the West Coast in California. So Washington all the way on down the West Coast, pretty much anybody in that I-5 corridor has to be a in the blueprint kind of guy.
Absolutely, because another person that same mold is Sam Utu from Orange Lutheran, where you want to make sure you can go attack the Trinity League, attack some of these top programs in California. And Orange Lutheran is absolutely one of them. Just another guy who 6'4", 6'5", in that 300-pound mold, where you want to continue to see that infusion of talent. We're going to, see what kind of turnover happens along the offensive line and just really along this, just with the rest of the program between now and the time the season starts with spring ball. You're still going to lose a couple of guys, probably see a couple more come in through the spring transfer portal window. So Sam, but that doesn't preclude the 2026 class. We saw what Washington wanted to do in 2025, and it was a great start along the offensive line. And I look at 2026 as the year where it's, all right, you built a strong foundation. Now you go. Because Jedd has talked about making sure you add as much talent as possible every single season. You want to build on it and stack it. And that's just another guy where the more I watch his film, the more I say, Washington, Brennan Carroll, whoever it is on that coaching staff, they need to make sure they're attacking the recruitment of Sam Utu.
No, I agree completely. And I think, that's the one thing we have seen from the staff is they know how to identify talent and they know how to go chase talent. One guy that I'm sure you probably know off the top of your head, Moa from Utah, the safety from I forgot his first name escapes me. They went to go visit him a couple.
Celeste Moa, yeah.
Celeste, thank you. I was like, I knew I didn't want to say Sewane because I'm like, I know it's not Sewane, but that's the one where we saw. I'm sure Brian Womack didn't include UW in his top 5 list at safety. Was a guy that UW was highly coveting early on in the process. And so I think that would be, it seems like the next kind of guy in that mold, similar to attacking, just that was kind of the next position I wanted to go at, where you're looking at the depth, and by the time you get to the 26th class, you're going to need another top end safety just to top everything off.
So I like where you're going in terms of the safety conversation there, because Braylon Womack, somebody who I'd had some conversations with him and his family before then, and the loss of Vinny Sinceri is what did that. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something where he was arguably the number one overall just target on Washington's board. And the loss of Vinny Sinceri is what did end up taking them out of the running. And so I'd expect just a little hint here. I would expect there to be some more news at the safety position, just in terms of potential moves on the coaching staff within the coming days and weeks. So it's something to keep an eye on there. And I'm glad you brought up Celeste Moa, because that is a really, really talented player who, as Washington continues to try and just build out the defensive backs room. But Lars, one more name that I just want to throw out that, in lieu of RJ Sermons, was a guy that I really liked that picked USC, and then Braylon Womack not going to end up at Washington. Just a guy to keep in mind that did include Washington's top 8 is Oaks Christian's Devon Benjamin. That's a really talented player. He plays safety right now at Oaks Christian, but might end up switching to corner at the next level. Just a name to keep an eye on, that elite top 100 prospect. I didn't know if I wanted to mention here, just in high-rated prospects we want to see Washington go after, because they certainly are in the hunt for him. But we need to talk about this in-state class, because it could not fix Washington, but really close the talent gap. Right after a message from our good friends over at Wayfair. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps me get back into routine. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the year, Wayfair has everything you need, all within your budget. I'm currently looking for a new couch, and their huge selection makes it easy to find the pieces that fit my style and budget. My favorite part, the free and hassle-free delivery, even for the larger items. Wayfair's site was so easy to navigate, and I found everything I needed in no time. Wayfair makes it easy to tackle your New Year's home goals with endless inspiration for every space. And what's your decor style? There's so many different things that you can find all over on Wayfair. Easiest way to check it out. You can give your home the refresh it needs with Wayfair. Just head to wayfair.com right now. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. Lars, Everybody around Husky football loves in-state recruiting. Now, this is a really, really interesting class because we just talked about Derek Colman-Brusa, but it's not just him. The top 3 players in the state of Washington are all edge rushers this season because there's Derek, then there's David Schwerzel, and there's Famateo Ciale, excuse me. Both those guys are at O'Day. They're both ranked 4 stars by the 247 Sports Composite. And as we look at this class, Washington's already got commitments from the number 4, number 5 players in the state of Washington, and Terrence Sarian and Wasi Olobi, who we've talked about on the show. Huge fans of them. Probably not going to dive too much into them particular today, because with these top 3 guys, you've got the body type with one of them to potentially try to find a way to move them inside and make that happen. But if you're able to lock up the top 3 players in the state of Washington, all playing arguably the largest position of need on your team right now, not only would that make fans happy in terms of they love to see all these in-state additions, but you're able to close the talent gap a little bit and just really continue to build trenches for Big Ten play, which as we saw in 2024 is just so immensely important.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the years when you could think, okay, I used this example before when it was I think it was the 2021 class when Ohio State had JTT on one side and Jack Sawyer on the other. And it's like, wow, how are you getting 2 guys at the same time? And now you look this past season, you need year in and year out to add 4-star guys in the trenches. And when you can do it in your own backyard, there is no excuse. Because the reason why I use that example is you can go to opposite ends of the country and try and, maybe keep one local guy home and then you got to go find another one. They're all in your backyard. And the other important thing here is you have history with both schools that they're at. Kennedy Catholic and O'Day are, I don't want to say UW pipelines, but, when
close
you look
enough.
at close enough over the years, because ironically, the last 2 came out of Bethel and Auburn Riverside. And you talk about Zayden Saleh and Jonathan Epperson. But I think that would almost more prove the point where it's like, hey, no matter where you are in the state of Washington, whether you're in Linden like Cade Eldridge or whether you're in Vancouver like Terrence Aaron, we want you to stay home in state. And I think when you look at the position of need, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's like by the time you get to the 26th class, Durfee's gone. Victor Sanchez Hernandez is probably, emerging and developing, and there's some other guys developing in that position. But there's nobody that I look at in the edge room right now that says, oh, in 2026, they're going to make it hard for some of these guys to see the field. These guys could all be on the field, making an impact versus, being buried in the depth chart.
Yeah, and it's a lot of it is just the big physical, like body type sort of thing, right? Where you look at previous defensive linemen from the state, Joe Tryon is the number 1 example that comes to mind. And it's, hey, this is a guy who's big, long, you like the way he projects out, but it might take a year or 2 for him to add some weight. You look at Derek Colman-Brusa, and he's got all the tools needed to potentially contribute early. And you could say the same for all of these guys, just in terms of they're both listed at 6'4", 250. Like all that in and of itself is a big benefit to what this coaching staff is trying to build up front. And just another guy I want to mention, since he is committed from the state of Washington, is Adyang Yang, is a really good example in that same light, where he's 6'3", 340, just looks like he could be just a true mauler on the interior of the offensive line. And that's somebody who I guarantee you that a lot of people are going to just look at that and without watching tape are just going to say, oh, they took an unranked guy who, he's a big body from the state of Washington this early on. Like, I don't necessarily understand that. But this is kind of the souped up version of that, in my opinion. And this might sound a little bit like a roundabout point here. But it's a great example of what this coaching staff is prioritizing in state. They're not just taking guys to take guys from the state of Washington, where it feels like, the previous coaching staff just didn't take in-state guys, where there just wasn't much of an emphasis placed there. And instead of just saying, hey, we're going to go make sure we take all of these guys from the state of Washington because we need to make sure that that's a priority. No, they went out and they said, hey, look at this guy who is 6'3", 340, moves really well at that size, plays a position of need along the offensive line. And we want to make sure we prioritize him before other schools have a chance to identify him later on in the cycle and get in on his recruitment. And that's obviously not going to be the case for some of these top guys, but you're building out the trenches, building position of need. And when you're able to do it close to home, it's just that much more important.
Well, and it's also good that for the most part, there's staff continuity on the defensive side. You still have Bala, you still have Kapusi, you still have Richardson. You still have somebody at least all 3 position levels on defense where you can say, hey, this guy that I walked in to go see Lowen last year at Kennedy. His younger brother already recognized me, even though I haven't gotten to know Ryan Walters as much yet, or know, whatever next coach is coming along the lines, as you mentioned. It's okay. Well, I still have some familiarity with the staff. Jedd's still there. There's enough common ground where you can say, hey, Ryan Walters, I know you know Robert Bala. You kind of all connect them together. But the reason why I say that is DeYoung was also low-key ranked as listed for at least a couple of days or a week as a defensive lineman on 247. And the reason why I bring that up is it could go both ways, whether he's an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman, that size, like if they end up seeing him on the defensive line, and he's 6'3", 6'4", 320, 330, 340, to me, that's like, okay, if you can find Logan Tagapalu in high school and bring that track along for all four instead of having to flip him halfway through his career, that could be a significant development along the UW defensive line as well, which makes sense with a 5-man defensive line.
So I like where you're going with that because that's going to be a really big part of this is seeing the way they're continuing to just build up this defensive line under Ryan Walters. But then as you continue to move forward, you want to see that continued emphasis on the trenches, and doing that in state is wonderful because it's something you and I have had conversations with people around the program about where, hey, the defensive line talent, especially on the interior, has been really, really tough to come by. It's been just like you look at the 2025 class on the West Coast. I know I made the example where Josiah Sharma was the only guy who anybody was really heavily pursuing. Like getting Dominic McCone out of Oregon was a very, very nice win. But there weren't a lot of those top end talents where you want to take Dominic McCone and two guys that are like a high 3 and a 4-star from California, Hawaii. But those guys just did not exist this year or in this past cycle. In 26, it's looking somewhat similar on the interior. Or there are a couple of guys. Bot Mulitalo was one I highlighted a couple of months ago on the show that he has since committed to Oregon. So that's just, we'll see what happens with that. But you're like, it's somebody I'm going to bring up a little bit later on, but there are players outside of the realm of Washington's normal footprint that you'd like to see. But if you're able to build the class around some of these in-state guys with all the ideal measurables that you're looking for, it's just a nice step in the right direction at the most important position at this point in time.
But it's also the one position where you can go, for example, take a Caleb Smith out of Alabama. They've offered some guys in Georgia and Alabama in the 26 class. And actually pretty early on, I remember those were like the January, February, March ones where when they offered Caleb Smith in the 25 class, they went to some other high schools and offered guys in the 26 and 27 class. And so you can see just in general, the mindset and this approach to this program is going to be, we want the body type. We prefer to go back in our backyard to get it, but we're also willing to take 3 from the backyard and maybe go get one more just from, Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee, wherever. And that's the one that you can do because it's like you're not putting all your resources into that one. You're putting most of them into the one at home, and then you're just going to get one more to supplement.
So you're absolutely right. And like the supplemental part of that is just as important in this, but it's like you always just want to see. I think this is something that I saw a lot of over the course of the season is people wanted to see more people from the state of Washington, just in terms of, hey, that passion for the Apple Cup, that passion for the program, because they grew up around it. They grew up in state. They grew up going to games. Drew Fowler is a name that I like to bring up because, that's a guy who, said, no, I'm not going to take my offer to UCLA or Louisville or Utah or wherever else, and I'm going to walk on at Washington because that's how passionate I am about the program. He's a unique example. But he's just kind of like the name that you bring up because that's what that is.
We should get him on the show because Drew's got a great story.
Absolutely.
and he's open to connecting.
Yeah. So there aren't a lot of good ways to transition out of that one. But Lars, let's talk about some of these top 100 guys that we'd love to see at Washington. Right after a message from our good friends over at Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in cancel subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. Plus, their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stress about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockdown today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockdown. One more time, rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Lars, there are a lot of really interesting top-end names in this class, and I'd love to see some of them come to Washington. I think the top guy on my list, I don't know about you, but somebody I'm really interested in is borderline 5-star wide receiver Brandon Arrington from Southern California. That's a guy who I know USC is really hot on his trail right now. But you talk about field stretcher. That's something that we really want to see in this offense. And we saw Jedd Fisch and Kevin Cummings really go out and prioritize wide receiver on the recruiting trail in the 2025 cycle. And I think they have a really interesting opportunity to do it again in 2026, where you got one speedster in Terrence Sarian, because that dude can move, man. He can run. But getting somebody else in that same mold and then adding a guy I'm going to get to in a minute would be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, I think the other thing to consider there is now that you've seen some kind of thinning out with Jason Robinson and Keith Reynolds going elsewhere in the transfer portal, now you can look at it and say, oh, hey, maybe those young guys where we thought there would be a logjam in the room, there's not as much there. And so I think I'm going to make kind of an overarching point to bridge to your next guy, because it's something where receiver is a good example of that, where you can say, well, they took 5 in 2025. How can they take 2 or 3 more in 26? It's like, well, you're going to have attrition one way or another. And that seems to be a position where no matter where they go and get the bodies from, Jedd is very confident that they can plug and play in the system. And so I'm not so much worried if, okay, let's say this one guy goes to USC. I wish Mark Bowman could reclassify, because that's the dude that I'm like, I know that, to be clear, that's a 27 name, so it's a long time to go, but it was the last name I asked Dash Brealey about. Like, hey, is there any Marcus Harris's in 26 that I should be looking at? And it was like, well, Mark's a 27 guy. I'm like, I know, but
yeah.
I think my point is the scheme is going to be appealing to a wider range of guys.
So absolutely, in that, because one other receiver I want to talk about is 5-star wide receiver Jett Washington from, I believe he's at Bishop Foreman in Las Vegas, and number one receiver in the country, 6'5", 200 pounds, what he's listed as. And I just look at this offense and I say, you want to continue to find room for a big bodied guy like that, where it's something that we've seen work in the Jedd Fisch offense with Tyrone McMillan. And this is like the closest example that you're going to get to that, in terms of just a guy who is going to go up and win jump balls every single time because of that size, because of his length. He's got nice athleticism. I think, as with a lot of kids his size, he's a really talented player, but he's going to need to continue to refine his route running at the college level, as a lot of them do. But that's a guy who, the more I watch him, the more I say, I don't think that one's going to happen. Let me be very, very clear about that. But that's just an example of, you want to try to find a way to get at least one of those talents into the room.
No, absolutely. Well, I think that's kind of the way the numbers are shaping up, to where you can look at it and say, they've offered I think over a dozen wide receivers in the 26 class. I want to say, I think the number's at like 13, 14, somewhere in that ballpark. And when you look at the numbers in that respect, you're able to cast a wide net, because now you're going to have, by the way, this is why the 26 class is so clutch in that regard. You're going to now have to combine Marcus Harris, whatever Audric does this year, plus whatever Denzel does this year. Now sure. Jedd's going to be able to say, hey, at Washington, because I wrote about this on Athlon Sports and I was talking about Kevin Green, and you now have 4 receivers that had 1,000 yards over the past 3 seasons. McMillan at Arizona, Singer at Arizona, Denzel at Washington, and there's one other one that I'm forgetting at Arizona. The point being that Jedd can literally develop any type of receiver. And you look at it and say, that's going to be appealing to a number of guys. And you're not necessarily probably going to get that guy early on in the process, because the numbers are so close at that position, where you can wait on a certain guy. And I think that's going to favor somebody like Jedd Washington, where he might not want to make a decision, or maybe even be considering visits into the season. That's the guy where it's like, hey, look, come watch Denzel every couple of weeks. See what you think, and then let me know in December. Similar to Marcus Harris, where it was a guy they were in big on early on, tailed off, commits to Oklahoma. By the beginning of December, it's like, oh, hey, we're right back in the thick of things. How did that happen? Well, they were there from day one.
No, absolutely. And so I'm glad you brought that up in the way you did. I wanted to just kind of steer this conversation back around to somebody I mentioned a few minutes ago when we're talking about building a defensive line primarily off of in-state guys, where this is like the name that, again, like Jett Washington. Does he end up at Washington? Probably not. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Elijah Golden, the defensive lineman out of Florida, where that's just a really talented player, where that's the caliber of player Washington hopes and wishes it could get its hands on and get into the program. Just one guy in that mold to really just kind of get a foot in the door and just say, hey, we're able to get these kinds of players. It's very clear that's what Jedd and this coaching staff want to do. Will they be able to? That's going to be an interesting test. But I kind of set that as a standard of if you're able to get a player in that mold from somebody, whether it be in Texas or somewhere in the South or in the Midwest or on the East Coast, just get one of those just style of defensive linemen, defensive tackles that can come in and potentially play really early on the interior. That's where I think this coaching staff needs to aim.
That's the IMG guy, right?
I believe he's at Cardinal Mooney in Sarasota.
Okay, well, no, because I was going to say, because there was a couple of guys at IMG that they've offered, and I think
I have an IMG name, yeah.
Well, the one thing that kind of intrigues me about that is that kind of tailoring into what I said at the end, when you can go get one of those guys like a Caleb Smith is, well, Steve Belichick had a lot of those relationships with the IMG guy that we learned about mid-season when he mentioned that during one of his press conferences. And so my thing will be, how much can Ryan Walters build on his East Coast relationships, being at Purdue, being at Missouri, being in the SEC footprint, so to speak? How much can that level Washington back up, given that you lost some of those relationships when Belichick left? That's what I'm just going to, my point in saying this is, can that same energy maintain given that you've had some changes on the coaching staff? I think it can. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
So as long as we're on defensive line, one guy who I probably would have put in the top targets class if we didn't spend just top targets part of this class, if I didn't spend so much time talking about the in-state defensive line, what that could look like, is Anthony Jones from Crean Lutheran in California. That's a 4-star player who's got Washington. I believe it's his top 6 is what he's down to at this point in time. Really just promising player that you can play at that outside linebacker stand-up edge role that Ryan Walters likes to have in his defense. So that's just a name to keep an eye on because I wanted to move over to the offensive line. And the IMG guy that I was referring to is somebody who took an unofficial visit during the course of last season. Again, we'll see how it plays out, but with a couple of IMG guys on this team, Raiden Vinesbright obviously being the big name there, is Keeyan Pepe, the 5-star, just mammoth offensive tackle, because he's originally from the West Coast. He's originally a California kid. So just a name to keep in mind that I want to throw out there and just say, as long as you're continuing to have that emphasis of building the trenches, that's a dude who, if you're able to get him on campus again, whether it be for an unofficial in the spring, if IMG wants to come back, or for an official visit, if that's possible, like that's just a top tier name that would be a tremendous addition.
That's the type of name that you need to be involved in if you're serious about being the CFP. Flat out. That's a name that, and I know it sounds kind of harsh to say that, but you look in the trenches, you need those 2-3 year guys who are going to be 4 and 5-star guys where you can say, hey, you know what? You'll probably play, 4 to 8 games as a freshman, and then by, your sophomore, junior year, you're going to be a 2-year starter, and then you're out of here. Those are the type of names where you look at the Georgias, the Alabamas, look at the investment Texas made in their offensive line over the past couple of years to get. Now, again, doesn't end up in a national championship, but look at Ohio State, look at Notre Dame, the 2 teams playing in the championship game. The trenches are there, and you have to go and find those. And yes, it's an investment. Yes, it's a massive undertaking, but the reward of the CFP and now again, obviously UW's offensive line last year wasn't necessarily built on 5 stars, but it was Roger Rosengarten. It was a bunch of other
4-star.
4
of the starting 5 offensive linemen were blue chip players. They were 4-star recruits coming into Washington. Yes, it's exactly that. So let me give you one more that's a little bit more within the realm of possibilities, but just a name that I personally want to keep a close eye on because he's a Pacific Northwest guy, and that's Kelvin Obot, who's ranked as the number 1 player in Idaho, offensive tackle, listed at 6'5", 265, but one of those guys who, in that same vein, where you want to find a way to boost the trenches with whatever talent you can find, the closer the better, just in terms of why would you want to go across the country when you feel you have a similar player in your backyard sort of thing. And that's just one guy who I'd say, hey, keep an eye on, because there could be a lot there, and it's your point. You're serious about building a CFP contender, finding as many blue chip offensive linemen as you can is a great way to do that.
And don't let Idaho think anything of it. Look at what Gardner Mamalo did. First guy that Scott Huff took back in 2017, 18, somewhere in that ballpark. No, 19. I don't even know what class at this point.
Yeah, he committed early. He was part of the class of 2020, but committed very early.
Okay, thank you. And I think when he committed in 2019, and that's what was so crazy is I remember hearing that take. I was like, God, go and get your rugged offensive lineman from the places less seen, shall we say.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the offseason. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating the channel through content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you don't miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. Let's hear your big board. Is there anybody that you're really interested in us talking about just in terms of offensive linemen? Drop it right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us 5-star reviews. It does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Thursday.